Be smart, it's your money.
The Confident Homeowner with Matt Tavara.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Confident Homeowner Podcast. Get ready for today's episode. I have Evan Meyer, Executive Director, Theodore Payne Foundation. Today, we're going to be talking about the do's and the don'ts of drought-tolerant landscaping, as well as what Evan thinks about artificial grass. So be sure to listen to the whole episode. Thank you for being here, Evan.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So what is, I obviously masonry and concrete, my main background, I'm a licensed general contractor. Drought-tolerant landscape, it's kind of like a buzzword. It's almost trendy now. Would you agree?
It's trendy for a good reason because there hasn't been any rain barely at all in the last couple of years. Yeah.
So what is drought tolerant landscaping? What does that mean to you? Like, how do you view that term?
So drought tolerant basically means that you don't need very much water to keep the plants alive in your landscape. That's in its simplest form. It's just plants that require very little water, or maybe not real plants, as we'll probably get into in a second.
What do you, and are you, just to kind of hit the nail on the head, so are you a big proponent of drought tolerant landscaping?
I am, for sure, because in Southern California, where we're in Los Angeles today, we get something typically in the range of 15 to 20 inches of rain a year. This last year, it was like 6 inches or something like that, and that's been many years of drought. Previously, like from 2013 on up, we had a couple wet years in there, but it's been, drought has been the norm, not the exception. So when we use water on our residential landscapes, it's not being used to grow food. It's not being used to, have habitat for fish in the streams. It's being kind of just used for something that we could do just as good a job with just different plant choices. So I'm definitely a big proponent of Los Angeles really rethinking what plants we use in our residential landscapes.
Yeah, and my experience with homeowners has been that, from a kind of a social good or a forward-thinking, progressive kind of movement, that drought-tolerant landscaping is something that they want to do. I find that pretty common. I find that, gosh, I would say probably 7 out of 10 homeowners have some consideration for water usage, which I think is good. It's a good first step. But
Yeah.
what I see is kind of the gap, and I'm really excited to cover this with you, is in my experience, I think that most homeowners that I've interacted with think that means gravel, decomposed granite, or artificial turf. And that's kind of where it seems to more for the general homeowner populace, that seems to be where it ends. I mean, what does it mean to you? What are the options? How do you consider this? Like, kind of talk us through all this.
Sure. Well, I think the reason that a lot of homeowners support it, outside of it being the good kind of progressive or environmentally friendly choice, is that you're going to save money because water is expensive. And if you're spending a lot of money every month on water, then that's something that you're not saving or having for other uses. So to me, I am an unabashed plant nerd. I am a botanist. I'm a horticulturist. And so I want plants around me, a lot of plants. When I think garden, I think plants. I think most people feel the same way. So when I hear a drought tolerant landscape, what immediately dings for me is use plants that don't take a lot of water. And I've been lucky in my life to travel the world, and I've been to South Africa, and I've been all over the deserts of North America, and I've been to Mexico a number of times. So I've seen a lot of just amazing landscapes, desert landscapes, Mediterranean shrub landscapes that are just filled with beautiful, gorgeous plants that take very little water. So I've seen with my own eyes like how cool these plants can be. And then once you go down that road, you also start to see all these other benefits that you get. So one of the big benefits from using plants that are low water versus doing something like concrete, which you just mentioned, is that you don't get the refractive heat problem. And that's something that a lot of people don't think about. They think, I don't want to spend money on water. I'm going to just pave over my whole yard. You see a lot of that. And it sounds good, but try standing out on that, at 2 p.m. in July. It's going to be toasty hot. So that's one of the benefits. The other benefit that we see using actual plants, and we'll get into the specifics of which plants, I think, in a little bit, is that it creates it creates habitat for things that you probably are actually pretty cool to have around. Like I have a 5-year-old, so we go out in our yard and she catches lizards and she looks at the butterflies and she gets this experience of interacting with nature at our house because of the plants we chose. So if you go with concrete or gravel or artificial turf, those experiences are just not going to be part of your life. So to me, that like makes life a more joyful and enriched experience. When I go out and I hear birds chirping and I see butterflies going around and I know that I've used barely no water to make that happen, it's just like, it just feels good as a homeowner and as someone who cares about this. It just makes me feel good to make that choice to go with the plants rather than the super low, you know, the gravel and the concrete and those types of things.
Yeah, and they've done studies, right? And I've researched this on my own time because I'm extremely passionate about this, as you are. You know, the effects of kind of plants have on humans. I mean, they've done studies of people who are sick and they go out in the hospital and they walk through trails and just interact with the plants. You also see a lot of plants at restaurants and they use them. And you know, like for example, like the WeWork space, like they have plants there. The one that I go to visit my friend, and so it's interesting to see that we use plants as a way to kind of interact with an environment, a built environment, to create a mood of almost like relaxation or whatnot. And so I think that you're bringing up a really interesting topic, which is it's kind of like the intrinsic value of plants, right?
Yeah, I mean, all the stuff you just mentioned like makes me think of forest bathing, which is something that they do in Japan where people will go out and bathe in the forest because it just makes you feel good. And it's like going on a hike or going on a picnic. You spend time out in nature, it kind of like recharges your battery. And so if you can create that effect at home, then you just, go out your door and get to have experience that. I don't know of any studies that say that, standing in on an astroturf field give you that same effect. So I think there is a lot of power in just like the kind of the wellness factor of being around nature and in your everyday life.
Yeah, especially with today's society, with things being so fast and so online and so connected, I think that there's such a benefit that I don't think that is always weighed out. It's one of those things where it's like, well, we know what it's like without it, but how much good could things be, or how much better could they be rather, if it were there? So, what do you? Let's say you're a homeowner and you're like, okay, I clearly want to not use as much water. I see the benefit there, right? That's a financial benefit. That's easy.
Mhm.
And we understand the value of plants in some capacity. What's the next step? Like how do I, what does that look like?
Yeah, so there's a lot of ways to do it. The first thing to know is that if you're in Southern California, there are rebates from the water companies. So if you have a lot of lawn, there are lawn removal rebates, and that's a good first step, just because it's another financial incentive. I think right now it's $3 per square foot of turf removed in LA. So if you remove 1,000 square feet of grass and put in drought tolerant plants, you get $3,000 back on water savings.
Wow.
So the first is probably to look at that and just get the financial benefit, because why not? It's out there. You might as well take advantage of it. And then you need to kind of come up with a plan. And there are two main ways that people go. There are the planners and there are the tinkerers. And the other way that I sometimes think about that is like there are the architects and the gardeners. The architects will sit down, whether they do this or they hire someone to do it, they'll sit down with a map of their space and they'll say, okay, right now I've got a whole bunch of grass. It takes water 3 times a week. I want to remove that and do something different. And they'll come up with a fully formed plan and execute that. And again, that might be done by someone they hire to help them with that. The other style, which is more my style, is the gardener or the tinkerer, where you remove a little patch of lawn, you put some drought tolerant plants in, you see what works, and you just kind of go through. So it really depends on how involved you want to get personally in the process. Like if you want to just hire someone to run you through it, there's great companies out there that can help with it. But I think, yeah, you might as well start with getting the rebates, getting the money because then if you do it right, you can pay for all the plants with just the rebate savings you get.
Now, what's like in terms of selecting plants? I know there's native,
Yep.
non-native? I mean, I know you have you're obviously very passionate about
Yeah.
one of them. I mean, tell
Yeah.
us why you're passionate about native plants, and
Sure.
also what does that even mean? And if I'm let's say I'm a tinkerer and I am excited to kind of look at some of these plants, and maybe we can talk about some specific ones that are really popular and common, and for what reasons.
Totally. Yeah. So, um, well, like I said, drought tolerant are just low water plants. So they're plants that are not going to need to be watered like every couple of days, like your typical lawn. You know, you have sprinklers on your lawn; they're run on a timer. With a drought tolerant plant, you're either needing, in some cases, zero water at all, or anywhere from 0 to 25% the amount of water of a conventional plant choice. Native plants are specifically the plants that occurred in a given place prior to um, prior to the kind of global movement and the colonial era. So in California, that means they were prior to Spanish colonization that happened here. And the reason that's important is because when Europeans really arrived and started making big changes to California, they weren't the first people to be here. You know, indigenous people had been here for many, many millennia, and many people, I think there's something like hundreds of thousands of people here, and they were moving plants around. They were changing, they were making impacts to the ecosystem, but what they were doing was actually enhancing the plants and enhancing the landscapes, and they weren't removing and replacing. And that's what happened when, during the colonial era, basically the whole ecosystems were removed and replaced with this new choice of plants. And what that ended up doing was, when you remove the plants, you remove the food source for all of the wildlife that lives on it. So think of all the hummingbirds and all the butterflies and lizards and all that kind of cool stuff. It's not adapted to live on your traditional conventional ornamental landscape plants. So with native plants, you can essentially go back and restore those ecosystems and restore a kind of a web of life. And I'm always thinking about, what's the future? And this is maybe like a little high, big concepts, but if we think, humanity in 50 years or 100 years, we're living right now through a biodiversity and extinction crisis, and we're losing species at a rapid clip. If we think 50 to 100 years in the future, what can we do to prevent that from happening? What can we do so that our kids and our grandkids and our great grandkids get to experience the joys of nature, get to experience all that benefit that we were just talking about of interacting and connecting with nature? Well, one of the ways we can do that is to rebuild nature in the places that we live. And that's basically what native plants allow you to do from a landscape perspective. You start to think of the built environment as a natural environment, and you're putting your builder contractor brain into the idea of restoring the environment. And that's really doable. And it's actually not any more difficult than conventional landscaping. It's just an idea that most people haven't kind of grappled with yet. So I'm always kind of out there talking about it and hoping people will just start to think about it. And it's not something you have to be all or none with. Like you can mix and match. So if you really like a particular agave, you like the way it looks, that's great. Like have that, but then maybe next to it, put something that's native and that's really going to support the local web of life, and then you'll start to get butterflies flying around your garden, and who doesn't want that, right?
That's what I was thinking. It's funny. The big takeaway here was I was like, man, if you could walk outside your backyard and have hummingbirds and butterflies, I don't know who looks at a hummingbird or a butterfly and goes, man, that thing's got to get out of here. Nobody's like,
Yeah.
let's get the gun and get these butterflies.
Yeah.
You're not doing that. I don't know anybody, especially, if you look at kids that are just fascinated and marveled by this, it's almost like a state change. You can be doing something and you just see it and you're like, wow, there's this appreciation for nature.
Yeah. And it actually ends up solving a lot of the other ecological problems that we have. So if you have a good functional ecosystem that you're creating in your home space, that's going to help deter things like mosquitoes that are not native and you don't want, probably. I hate mosquitoes.
Really?
Like most people. So if you like conventional landscapes as they currently exist, which are watered three times a week or more, that is what breeds mosquitoes in Southern California. And if we had all dry landscapes, there wouldn't be places for mosquitoes to grow. So we're talking about kind of replacing this totally artificial world in terms of a natural context of this artificial ecosystem that we've created with our modern kind of garden palette and creating a new one. And that actually has a lot of benefits. Like one of the biggest benefits is there'll be way less mosquitoes if we do this.
Why do you think it is that, I mean, where did this come from? The idea of turf or artificial turf and just kind of the more traditional landscape. And why is there not a renewed emphasis on native plants for both, the reason of butterflies, hummingbirds, local habitat, but also just kind of biodiversity?
Yeah. It starts, I think, with probably the European aristocracy, where the really wealthy European people had, their castle or whatever, and around it they had their pasture lands,
Mm,
and that was like the status symbol because
interesting.
you were like a rich aristocrat. And then over time, it moved from just your pasture lands to like this that became incorporated as I'm just going to have this. I have a piece of land. I just want this big lawn because that's kind of what I'm used to, and that's a status symbol. So, and then that eventually gets like transplanted around the whole world, and you end up with lawns being like one of the defining characteristics of the American landscape. And not to say there isn't use for lawns. Like I have a kid, we go to the park, we run around on the grass, we kick the soccer ball. We have a little patch of drought tolerant lawn, which is a special kind of grass lawn in
What
our
kind?
backyard.
What kind of grass?
Bermuda grass lawn,
Okay.
which works really well for. There's a couple that you need fairly little water, and you can let them go completely dry in the summer if you don't mind them going brown. They'll come back green.
Really?
So there's use for lawn, at times. Like if you're going to actually be playing on it, playing soccer on it, any of that stuff. Like I wouldn't say there should be zero lawn at all, but when you see a giant expansive lawn that no one's walking on and it's taking up tons of water and it's not providing any of that habitat or ecology, that's really to me just like a historical artifact of kind of just like the development and trend of what was fashionable in the landscape industry, because really it's just a trend, right? It's just what's in style at any given time.
It makes so much sense. It's almost like one of those unquestioned things, right? It's like almost like keeping up with your neighbors. It's like, well, I mean, well, at that point, in our current day and age, it's well past that because the homes are mostly already built, and so they've already built with certain square footage of yard and layout of yard, and so, wow, that's a fascinating kind of thought to think about. Well, where did the lawn idea come from, and why isn't this more talked about? So in terms of specific types of plants, like if I'm going to do, so I guess I want to make the distinction first of, so there's drought tolerant and there's native. And I think we did a good job of kind of defining the two and some of the, in your opinion, some of the benefits of both native as well as drought tolerant.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's say that I'm more intrigued about what it means to have kind of native plants. Where do I go? What do I look for? Are there like some really common, like are there any native plants that I would probably already know about? Like,
Well, if you know sage, even if you know kitchen sage,
yeah,
that's from Europe, but that's related. It's in the genus called Salvia. That's the genus being the scientific way
yeah.
of describing plants. There are a whole bunch of different wild sage species in California, and they all are really aromatic and they have that beautiful smell. And tons of them that would grow locally in the hills. So have you ever hiked through like the Hollywood Hills or anything? You smell a plant, you're like, what's that? It's probably a sage. I mean, there's so many great plants. Like, I don't know which, just my top three maybe or something like that.
Yeah. Let's do your top three.
Top three, white sage.
Okay.
Beautiful silvery foliage. Has a really nice smell. It has these flowers that kind of come up in really tall spires with white flowers, and if you leave the flowers at the end of the season, they'll turn into the seeds, and then the birds will just literally be landing on these little towers in your garden and just like plucking the seeds out. It's really fun to watch. It's a really important medicinal and spiritual plant for the indigenous people of Southern California, and it's just, I think every garden in Southern California should have at least one. They take very little water. Another sage I'll have to say is one called hummingbird sage. And the leaves of that one smell almost like watermelon. Like it's got this really fruity, pungent smell. They call it hummingbird sage because it's pollinated by hummingbirds. So it's got these purple flowers that hummingbirds will come in and stick their beak into to get the nectar out. And that one is really useful because it grows in dry shade. And that's kind of a hard condition to find really good plants for. You know, in gardening and horticulture, the things you have to really focus on are how much light do you have, how much water are you going to give it, and what's the soil like. And the combination of it's going to be really dry and it's going to be really shady. There's not a ton of plants that tolerate that well, but hummingbird sage really likes that. So it's a great choice for that. And then the third one, and I could literally do this for like 10 hours.
Right,
So
yeah.
stop me. But the third one, I'm going to go with another aromatic plant. And funny enough, all three of these plants I mentioned are in the mint family. But there's a plant called woolly blue curls,
Okay.
which smells like if you can tell, I like the smells, and you know, like that's another way to it's not just about how they look, it's also about how they
Yeah.
smell and how they feel.
Yeah.
Woolly blue curls, you smell it, and it basically, if I could describe the smell, the best description I can give is blue Gatorade.
Really?
Yeah, like it smells like artificial, like candy smell,
Wow.
and it's really beautiful. The Spanish called it romero because it looks like rosemary, but it's in the same family as rosemary, but it's just this beautiful plant. I also love it because we at my organization, the Theodore Payne Foundation, we make a beer with Eagle Rock Brewery, a local brewery, and we put woolly blue curls into that beer,
Really?
as along with black sage and California bay tree.
Wow.
So those are my top three, but there's like so many more, you know.
So what would you say is the reason why this isn't more, and I'll use the word mainstream because I think it's safe to say that it's
Mhm.
not as mainstream as it can be. If I knocked on 10 homeowners' doors and I
Yep.
said, "Hey, what do you know about drought tolerant landscaping?" I think we'd have a fair amount of them would have some idea or understanding. But then when you get into native species, native plants, why you might want to consider it versus not. Why do you think it is that there's kind of an information gap, if you will?
Well, yeah, I've thought about that a lot, and one of the reasons I think is just because people typically don't spend a ton of time thinking about plants. I've noticed, because as someone who spends almost all my time thinking about plants, like your average person is going about their day worrying about other stuff. And the landscape industry tries to make it as kind of, make plants essentially like widgets. Like they want them to just be totally standard, interchangeable, which makes sense because most of the nurseries now are big industrial processes. Like you go to a Home Depot, that's an industrial. They want things as interchangeable and as much as like just a widget as possible. And then our landscape aesthetic really favors like straight lines. You see the hedge trimmers coming out, you see the mowers. It's very just like the straight, squared off. That's really not what native plant gardening is all about. Where it's more about letting the plants express themselves freely and growing in the way they want to grow. So it's a little bit of a different aesthetic, which actually some of the best designers out there use that aesthetic, and that's really the current trend in landscape architecture. So I think in 10 to 15 years, you'll actually start to see a big shift just where landscape architecture is right now. But I think it's mainly that like it's a combo of a landscape industry that's focused on like thinking of plants and gardens as like kind of art in the sense of like you want all square lines and straight lines, and that it's easier to do that with plants that you just shear into boxes. And you can do that with some native plants, but it's typically not what's done. And then the other combo of people just not having a whole lot of time to devote to learning about it. And then it's just kind of the where we're at like historically, again, like gets back to like what was the history leading up to this moment. And a lot of the plants that came into Southern California, like some of the neighborhoods look like Greenwich, Connecticut, because people wanted to create that, or some of them look like a Spanish villa in Madrid or whatever, so people wanted to recreate that. So I think it's kind of ironic because everyone loves California, they love hiking here, they love like going to Big Sur and all that stuff, and it just, for whatever reason, it's catching on, and it's been around. Like the native plant movement is not small. There's a lot of people behind it, but you're right, it's not mainstream. And I think the other one is just that to maintain and grow the plants is a little bit different than conventional landscaping. Like I said, you just, it's not harder. It just is done a little differently. And so your average landscape contractor might not have kind of worked with them much before, and it's a little bit of a different style.
Well, I mean, my mind is blown because you hit on so many things that make so much sense. It's like, okay, first of all, distribution, right?
Yep.
It's geographic
Mhm.
and hyper geographic, really,
Yep.
because it's native. So it's
Mhm.
like, well, and this is where it shifts and changes, and then it's like, okay, well, then you have to educate the contractors installing it. You have to educate I mean, there's so many touch points, right? You have irrigation, right?
Yep.
And whether or not you need it at all, and what to do with your irrigation system. And then you have the landscape designers, and then you have the nurseries, and if they're big or small, and the smaller ones might be more open to having it, but might not immediately have the audience to where they can support that because it's a living thing. And
Yep.
so it makes so much sense why it's like, here's this really great concept of drought tolerant native plants, and here's the reason, because when you can figure out why something is not there, I think that helps people kind of understand or reason as to, because that's always the question. It's like, well, if this is so great, why isn't it everywhere? And I think when you can answer that question and kind of unlock it, you get this aha moment like I just had, where you're like, holy crap, like this makes total sense. Why you can have something that really makes sense on so many fronts, but if you look at the way this has to kind of flow through distribution. So to what you're saying, and I think what we're hopefully accomplishing here is at the homeowner level
Yeah.
is to be an advocate for it and to research it and understand it.
Yeah, and it's the homeowner level people, because there are nurseries. Come to our nursery,
course.
Theodore Payne Foundation, in Sun Valley, and there are other great ones. My friend Nicole runs Artemisia. Friends Matt and David, Plant Material, are friends over at Hahamunga. So there's a community of nurseries. We all support each other. I think native plants right now in all of California, it's about 3% of the entire nursery industry. So it's a drop in the bucket.
Are these nurseries okay with people coming in and just really learning and asking questions and kind of
for sure.
understanding?
That's
And
what we're all about. Yeah.
yeah.
All these nurseries love to educate people. If you're a first timer, like that's great. We come learn. Our nursery in Theodore Payne, every plant has like really detailed information on it.
Really?
You can really like dig in and get to learn. We also do classes at Theodore Payne. We do about 60 classes a year, and we have all kinds of like outreach events. So if you're just like want to engage more and learn more, just theodorepayne.org is our website. And there's other couple of great resources. One that I'll mention called Calscape. If you're in California, and if you haven't, if you like don't know exactly what plants to choose, it has all these cool filters where you can put in like where your address is, what do you want to achieve with your garden, like do you want it to be super drought tolerant, do you really want to focus on like butterfly habitat, like any of those things. You can punch them in and
You can set an end goal basically.
It'll just spit out a list of plants. Wow. And then it'll tell you what nurseries have those plants. That's calscape.org. And then the one last little plug, if you're like wanting to kind of get more of the conceptual idea behind this stuff, is there's a professor on the East Coast who writes about native plants named Doug Tallamy, and his book called Bringing Nature Home like really goes through the reasons why native plant gardening is just a really great option, and the work that he's done over the last 20 years studying it and documenting it at his own property in Pennsylvania, because it's a global movement. Like we're talking from a California perspective here, but this idea of humans learning to live with nature and then developing the supply chains and the workforce and all the things that need to go with that, like that's happening around the world. And as we're going through climate change and all these environmental issues that we're facing, like the development of all this stuff, I think is going to be like a really exciting thing to be part of and to be involved with.
Yeah, I mean, we have the same, we went to the same college, ironically, we found out before and my minor was environmental design. So I've always been really, really passionate about the topic. Kind of just a little bit of a slant here, but are herbs or any type of edible plants, are there any native ones in California area here that you can think of offhand?
Sure.
It's kind of a fun fact.
Yeah. Well, native grapes, there's a bunch of different species of, there's actually a couple that we really recommend for home gardening of native grapes that produce really nice. They're kind of tart, but I have some friends who make wine from our native grape species.
Wow.
Yeah. A lot of the kind of aromatic sages, some people will use in cooking. Mm-hmm. The big food source for the indigenous people of California was acorns, and there's a process, and it's still done. I'm actually going to an event this weekend. It'll be all about native plant foods run by the Kauai out in the the Banning Pass area, and yeah, making like flour out of acorns. So there's a lot of native plant food related things, and we also do advocate for home gardening. Like you can have your vegetable garden and your native plant garden, and they work really well together as long as you have different irrigation zones on them. Like you need to water your vegetables a lot more than your native plants.
Wow.
So it's, it's not all or none. You can do some native plants, some non-native vegetables. It's really just thinking about like, what do I want to do with my landscape? Like if I have this piece of land, like what are my opportunities with it? And then like, I think you'll find if you get involved with it, it's like pretty fun. You can really go down the rabbit hole and like start to really explore like, where you are, where you live, and beautiful life that surrounds us.
Well, I mean, to kind of wrap it up and close it up, I hope that we've accomplished the goal of at least opening the conversation to native plants, to asking your designer, if you're going to have a designer design your space, or if you're going to tinker, going to, Theodore Payne Foundation here at Nursery, and just kind of it starts with a little bit of information, a little bit of interest, and like most things, it grows from there, I imagine.
Totally. Yeah. Start small, dip a toe in the water, go to one nursery, get one book, talk to your landscaper about it. And I will one final plug if I can.
Yeah, of course.
We do a training at Theodore Payne Foundation for landscapers, and it's currently offered for free if you're in the Los Angeles area. And basically it's 18-hour training on how exactly to maintain native plants and how to sell that service to your clients. So if you're in the landscape industry and you want to get some free training and get a certification as a native plant landscaper,
wow,
and add that to your bag of tricks, because it's kind of a boutique product right now. So if you're in the landscape business, like get in touch with us at Theodore Payne Foundation, and we'll get you certified, and you can, and there's a whole bunch of stuff about like how to market that and incorporate that into your business model. So
yeah, and if you don't care about humans, do it for the butterflies and the hummingbirds, okay?
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, Evan, thank you so much for being here. I honestly had a blast. I'm really excited, and I would be interested to watch this in 5 years and see just how much of this movement has occurred.
Hopefully a lot.
Yeah,
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.